Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. Two men with a combined age of 146 are the unlikely Pied Pipers of many of today's disaffected youth. Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and Bernie Sanders in the US. Ageing and certainly unfashionable in appearance, well, they've helped make socialism fashionable again. What have they got? And more importantly, perhaps, what is the message? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. We will be asking our panel to define what socialism means today. We'll ask whether it's here to stay and whether it can really change politics as we know it.
They're young, angry and fired up by the thought of inheriting a world of inequality and injustice. Increasing numbers of millennials are turning to socialism as the answer. A 2018 Gallup poll found that more young Americans were positive about socialism than capitalism. And in an age of rising populism and polarizing global politics, a new generation of the left is emerging. There's been a surge in support for Bernie Sanders, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the UK's Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, who proudly accept the socialist label. And their ideas are moving from the fringes of politics into the mainstream. So what does it mean for the future of politics? And how much of a threat is it to the capitalist establishment?
Okay, let's get talking. At the round table, we have Batmaz, member of the Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union. James Tweedie here too, former international editor of the socialist newspaper The Morning Star. Aaron Brandon Gomez here too, founder of the Chelsea Young Conservative. And Kristian Niemietz, author of Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. Great to have you all here. Let's get to your book first of all. A failed idea. In what way?
Well, both economically and also in the sense that it's always and everywhere lead to political oppression and authoritarianism. We've had more than 24 experiments, more than 24 attempts to build socialist societies over the past 100 years. From the Soviet Union to Venezuela, they've all ended in varying degrees of economic collapse, and they've all led to pretty horrible dictatorships. So it clearly is a failed idea.
James, where does it work?
Where does it work? Well, I think the first question, I mean, you've got to distinguish between a revolutionary workers' state, you know, if you're talking about socialism or social democracy. Look at Cuba, for instance. I mean, everyone says, oh, Cuba's so poor. But actually, in Cuba, everyone has a home. Everyone has a job. Everyone's fed. All the children go to school. There's very little crime. You can walk the streets of Havana at night. You can't do that in Mexico City.
Where else?
China's
not a socialist state, is it?
You don't think so?
No, it's a communist party state that controls the people. It's a one-party state, that's what it is.
Well, maybe it's a one-party state, but it's a state that's it's a workers' state.
It's now a capitalist communist society.
Well, all right.
Look how many middle-class millionaires there are in China now. That's not a socialist state.
Okay.
Like Soviet Russia is a very extreme example of this. We look at states like Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, places like that where social democracy works and really well. People's happiness levels are much higher.
But this isn't socialism by definition. In those Nordic countries, they have been described as socialist by some people who want to encourage the idea, but they are known more generally as compassionate capitalist society.
David, I'd love to intervene if possible.
Of course you can.
Because I can't sit
and
here...
we will come back to you. You didn't get finished, James, but we will come back.
Can't sit here and accept the idea that the Nordic countries, Denmark, etc., are somehow socialist or social democracies. The reality is that the Prime Minister of Denmark said in the 2016 elections in the US, when Bernie Sanders kept on using the example of Denmark as an example of a socialist country that America could aspire to be, he said, stop using us as an example. He said, we are a market economy. And the reality is that if you look at Denmark, if you look at Sweden, you look at Norway, their economy is based on oil. It's based on free markets, goods, services coming in. And you know, I admit that they do have a high sort of social welfare.
Well, there's a safety net, a
welfare state.
Yeah, for which. Shen, no, I will come back to you, but you didn't finish, so carry on.
No.
You were talking about the Nordic countries. I was saying compassionate capitalism.
You need to remember as well that Sweden, not so long ago, had a plan in place where they were going to nationalise everything little by little over the years. It was a socialist state, it was a socialist democracy, right? So people there have things like the safety net. They don't have a minimum wage because wages are decided by unions having recognition there. They have a lot of co-ops, they have stuff like that. So their actual the way that their society works, it may be capitalist, it may be compassionate capitalist or whatever, but the actual safety nets that are in place and the things that happened in that country to make it so that people can live better lives.
What I'm trying to establish
was from
here,
socialism.
Jen, what I'm trying to, and we can all say something about this, what I'm trying to establish here is what we're seeing something new, or is it just a desire not to have what we've got at the moment? Is it the old socialism, which I've just tried to define,
I think
which is an ideology, or is it just a slightly fairer society?
Look, I think what we have is the phenomenon that you're seeing, that you're talking about today, comes from a disillusionment with the established political parties, both the social democratic parties and the conservative parties. And one of the manifestations of this was Brexit, you know, you may say ironically, and another one was the election of Donald Trump in the USA, because young conservatives, I mean, not the young conservatives of the Conservative Party, but there's a lot of...
conservatives with a small c, yeah.
Yes, young small c conservatives around the world are also disillusioned with their conservative parties who have embraced a lot of liberal ideas, because liberalism is the ideology of capitalism, such as globalization and the European Union, and they, you know, they're rebelling against that. You see with the social democratic parties in Europe, and social democracy is the dominant form of capitalism in Europe, let's face it, in the developing world, in the developed world, sorry. Those parties over the last 20 years have sold out the working class in so many ways, imposing austerity programs.
What we're not seeing is socialism in its ideal stated form. We're seeing a hoped-for social democracy.
No, indeed.
So it has changed, hasn't it, Kristian?
Not really, no. I mean, that's what socialists have always said over the years, that as soon as the Soviet Union fell out of fashion with the beginning of the Cold War, every time there was a new socialist project, socialists have always said, this time will be completely different. That's what people said in the 60s about Maoist China, about Vietnam, and about Cuba as well, saying this time will be completely different. And then it turned out in the end it wasn't so different after all. Then in the 70s it was other examples. There were Western socialists who admired Cambodia, Albania, Tanzania, Angola, and they always said this time is going to be totally different. And not so long ago that's what a lot of people also said about Venezuela. From the mid-2000s to until about 3-4 years ago, you had lots of people on the British left, the American left, saying,
well, I believe that Jeremy Corbyn still supports Maduro and the Chavez legacy in Venezuela. The problem is it's led to complete disruption of the country's economy and repression of individuals.
Sure, that's how socialism always ends.
It's catastrophe. I mean, socialism has a track record. People vote with their feet. Trust people. People vote with their feet, and where socialism touches, people run for their lives. The only thing socialism brings about in the world, I mean, it's not going to sound great, but it's stacked up corpses. You look anywhere you go, at least 100 million Maoist China, at least, conservative estimate, small c, small c.
Big C, conservative.
Seriously, the reality is that people want to...
Yeah, but extreme ideologies, whether it happens to be socialism or whether it happens to be a form of fascism or whether it's simply dictated, they all end up going horribly wrong, and people
But they all have one thing in common, don't they?
I'm saying it's not just the socialism.
I don't think that we can compare socialism to fascism.
I'm not comparing, I'm just saying they're both extreme.
They're exactly the same. They're exactly the same. The core identity of both of those things, if you think about it, Mussolini was the founder of fascism. If you know your history, he was a socialist. He was a socialist at university. When he ran for...
Actually, fascism goes back to the 19th century, and some might say it goes back to Plato's time. I don't think he founded fascism.
I'd say he's
He was an anti-communist. His first target was also the communist.
He ran as a socialist when he first ran for the elections in Italy, and he ran so far to the left.
I think we are getting a little bit off the point here. I was simply saying that they are the extreme ends of different types of ideologies. So what I want to say to you is, if as we mentioned, Venezuela is probably the most modern example we have of it. Has it worked?
But the thing is, we need to look at the outside factors of it as well. So with Venezuela, and with, you were saying before about a lot of socialist economies collapsing and stuff like that, but we need to look at the reason for that. And the reason for it is capitalist economies, like America being the biggest example, the way that they influence that. And if we talk about Maduro, he won his election, his last election, with a bigger margin than Theresa May or Donald Trump.
Call that an election?
He's a Democrat. What do you?
Yeah, it wasn't an election.
They're trying to force him out with someone who hasn't even been through an election.
That was the most derailed election of elections in recent times. I mean, if that's an election,
yeah, but the opposition participated, and they said they would.
Isn't the fact,
politics,
Shen, one second,
the
Kristian.
economy has clearly collapsed, and long before the US did anything.
Okay, well, Shen, isn't the real problem here that you have grown up with austerity? You haven't known capitalism working for you, and that's why perhaps you think there should be a kind of fairer way of doing things, and you don't really know. And excuse me for sounding patronising here, you don't really know what socialism is like to live under.
I think, for me, socialism is hope, and that's what it will always be for me. And that's, I mean, I have grown up under austerity for most of my life. I've grown up in, you know, I'm from a different side of the tracks to, I'm guessing, you guys. I've worked precarious jobs. I've seen friends become homeless. I've experienced all of these sides of life, the negative sides of life that austerity brings. And austerity itself is a product of capitalism and is a product of neoliberalism. It's not just, austerity doesn't stand alone in the system. It's not just its own thing.
You mentioned the fact that you were able to go on strike because you were part of this McDonald's, etc. strike not so very long ago. But you could go on strike in any fair society. It wouldn't have to be a socialist. Well, it isn't a socialist society.
How easy is it to go on strike? How easy is it to... Margaret Thatcher left a legacy for all kinds of things, one of them being trade unions and our ability to come together to organise. When we went out on strike in McDonald's, it was difficult. And that is because it was made difficult on purpose to try and stop us coming together. Socialism is about collectivism. It's not about the individual. It's about collectivism and taking care of each other.
David, I'd like to just comment on the austerity point because, firstly, we should define austerity. It simply means, you know...
Oh, you haven't got that long. We've done so many programmes on
3 seconds. You have £1,000, you spend £900. That's austerity. So you're responsible, you spend...
Or you have £1,000 and you spend a £5.
You can do that either.
It all depends how you look.
But the point is you just don't outspend what you make. And on the point of, you know... I don't want to bring up backgrounds.
What's the IMF
I don't think it's got. I don't think.
Okay, this is where we're going slightly.
I don't think capitalism has anything to do with your background because I know you had a difficult upbringing, but so did many other people. I grew up in care. I've been homeless. I've experienced all kinds of different things in life, but it's nothing to do with capitalism. Capitalism has helped you. You pull out the phone from your pocket. You can get a taxi in however many seconds. You can get food anywhere you want.
Kristian,
you can save your money.
I hear what you're saying, Aaron. Kristian, James. I've been reading this book. Funnily enough, I didn't even know we were going to be doing this programme. A Brief History of Capitalism by Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister of Greece. This is something that applies to this conversation. He quotes Oscar Wilde on socialism here, who says the trouble with socialism is that it takes too many evenings. Nobody ever gets anywhere.
Well, I've been to a lot of meetings, yeah. Listen, I mean, capitalism is not an eternal system. Capitalism is slightly more than 200 years old as an economic system.
Well, it depends. In this book, he says it's been around since trade's been around.
Oh, no,
because trade gives you the means
to
obtain power, and that is capitalism.
No, that's rubbish.
It's individual choice.
Before capitalism, there was about 300 years before the Industrial Revolution started in Manchester, in Britain, in the late 18th century. There was about 300 years where the dominant economic system in the world was what you might call mercantilism, but really, that's a polite way of saying
but when you had empires, you had
slave trade.
You had the Mongol Empire, that was a form of...
And before that, there was feudalism. Before that, there was feudalism. How did we move from these one system to another? Well, in Britain, we had a revolution in the mid-17th century, which was a civil war, which was in fact 4 different wars. After the second one, we beheaded the king. After the third and fourth one, we took a lot of royalist soldiers and sold them into slavery condemned them to slavery in the West Indies.
What does this got to do with socialism, which is what we're talking about?
Because you move from one system to another by revolution. That's the only real
And that's what we need.
Well,
do you think so?
I think it's inevitable. It's inevitable. It's how history has progressed. When they moved from slavery to capitalism, when capitalism became the dominant mode of production in the United States, how did that happen? That was through the American Civil War. How many people died in that war? About 600,000? 2% of the population wiped out in a war.
Let's talk about the United States.
So this is how things work. In the French Revolution,
we need
tens of thousands.
We need a revolution. We mentioned in the reporter's package at the beginning that more and more Americans are finding socialism a great idea. Now, I lived and worked in the United States for 5 years, and it was almost an insult at that time in the 80s, early 90s. What's changed?
Once again, socialists are very good at distancing themselves from real-world examples of socialism. If you debate socialism only as an abstract ideal and you compare it to real-world examples of capitalism, then of course capitalism comes up short, because then you can talk about food banks and homelessness on the one hand, and on this romantic ideal of a democratically run, worker-run economy on the other hand, then you have an unfair comparison. Then socialism always seems more attractive. We have to either compare one real-world example with another real-world example, or if we're talking about theoretical ideals only, as we do with socialism, then we also have to concede that capitalist economies have a lot of room for improvement.
Couldn't socialism work if it were introduced properly and fairly?
This is the argument of every socialist ever. Put me in charge, I'll get it right. Don't listen, because it's just going to end in the exact same way as everyone else has said that.
But when you're a child, when you're all very small, yeah, we all think, because we're told by our parents, I hope, that it's good to share, it's good to be kind, it's good to look out for others. These are all the pillars of socialism.
No, these are voluntary decisions within small communities. In your family, go ahead, be a socialist. Parents give to your children, children give to your sisters and brothers. These are small communities, you make voluntary decisions. Socialism is about taking the individual choice away from you and saying, well, democratic socialism, we're going to vote to steal your money. It's still stealing. There's no difference. I think if you want to give your money to charity, as happens in capitalist societies, give it away. Funnily enough, what are the two countries, the most generous countries in the world? Happen to be capitalists, don't they? UK, the US. We give the most to charity per capita, and we're capitalists. How much money do socialist countries give to charity?
The point is that you shouldn't have charities. A world in which charities exist is by default a world that is not fair. If someone cannot eat, they cannot afford
People don't
to.
make mistakes.
But you're talking
Gambling?
about stealing. You're talking about the socialist government stealing. Let's talk about stealing. What about CEOs? You're talking about phones.
What did CEOs
Workers create phones. Workers create phones. Workers create the apps. Workers do the deliveries on the apps. They drive the cars. They do all of this. So who is stealing?
They get paid.
When they're how much?
Well, why don't they set up their own cooperative
Minimum
then,
wage,
if
which
they're
is
doing
nothing.
all the
A
work?
minimum wage was introduced by a socialist
Because
government.
what capitalism does is it takes the power away from you to be able to do that, because you do not have the means of production. That's
This
the
is
argument,
it.
isn't it?
This is
Well,
it.
I mean, you can't set up a cooperative to make cars until you own a car
So why
factory.
didn't Vietnam ever invent
Start
Facebook?
small
5
scale.
minutes,
Every
but
business
before.
starts small scale.
It's true.
About a tenth of the workforce, or even more, are self-employed. So that shows it clearly is not impossible to set up a business to get
There
a
is
bank
that
loan.
ancient-
And you can
let
do
me
that
put you
with
the
a
same
cooperative.
point.
Only 80%
Sorry,
of
James.
businesses fail in the first year.
Can I put
Yeah,
you
of
the
course.
same point
Only
that I
80%,
put
and then most of them
to
fail in
Aaron,
the second year.
which is that when you're small, perhaps sometimes when you grow up as well, you think it's good to share, it's good to help, it's good to support, it's good to do all of these things. So where does it go wrong?
I don't know any supporter of a market economy who says sharing is bad or charity is bad. It's just that this
Except the
idea...
bloke who pockets a £3 million bonus while his
But you don't know how much
employees are
they're
on a
giving to
minimum wage.
charities every year. You don't know what
come
they're
on.
doing.
No, you don't know.
But it
Exactly.
doesn't-
You're not
but
supposed to-
just
Well,
the act of having
Shen,
a million.
I want to
you
ask.
cannot, yes.
I want to ask you that question. Do you think, and this is one of the questions I posed at the beginning of the programme, that these ideas have taken hold and will continue to grow? Each one of you.
My answer is yes. I mean, my book that you mentioned is called Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. And I think it will not die. It should, but it won't.
I mean, I think it depends on the demographics. I think amongst young people, it's clearly going to increase in its grasp upon them, and it's simple. Young people, they don't appreciate. I'm young as well, so I speak for myself
How old
too.
are you?
But 22, 23,
Yeah.
23. But don't appreciate money. So if you, as a conservative or someone on the right, say, look, well, socialism is too expensive, it's not an argument that's going to convince them. It's not. When they're seeing money spent on wars and things like that, they'll say, why can't we spend that on socialism? So what you need to argue is the truth about socialism, which is that it is morally wrong. It's evil. It's about envy, greed, taking from people who have done nothing to you. It's about identity politics, grouping people up into society and carving them up.
But it sounds to me that that's what people who
tax.
exert power over other people do when they're taking massive bonuses and huge profits and setting up in tax havens.
You tell me how J.K. Rowling exerts power over people by writing a book, her own labour, doing very well, starting small, selling it to movie companies, selling it to theme parks, selling it to merchandisers. You tell me how Mark Zuckerberg and his friends at Harvard, when he dropped out of college, oppressed women and children out there by making Facebook.
Look, I don't want to get into this, but Facebook was set up initially to get these guys' girlfriends.
Well, how many businesses would end tomorrow if Amazon and Facebook disappeared?
Your turn.
How many?
Your turn. Is it here to stay?
I think it's not going to go away. I think change is natural, and people realise that. It's heartening that people haven't accepted what Francis Fukuyama said 20 years ago. That
explain who that is.
Well, he's an American economist, theoretician, who said that it was the end of history. Now it was the end of history after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was dissolved. That was the end of history, and there's only one economic political system, which is capitalism and liberal democracy, and very soon that would spread over the whole world. And it hasn't happened, and he's, in fact, revised his own ideas about that. But it's not history doesn't have an end. It doesn't have an end point, right? And people realise that there's change. There's always change.
Yeah.
And
you think that change will come through revolution?
That's not what Marx thought.
Should have been here when we did the programme.
yeah, I know. Shame he couldn't be here. He died in 1882. So that society's been through we've been through various kinds of society, and society will continue to change in the future, and history doesn't have an end.
Okay, Erin's 23. Shen,
24.
Yeah. Tell us, just to help us round this argument up.
I think the climate, the school strikes for the climate, the increase in demonstrations and marches and young people being disillusioned with capitalism does mean that socialism, and it's not just about it being fashionable, it's about it being a necessity. As long as people continue to starve, as long as people continue, like homelessness is at, 320,000 homeless on our streets. As long as that continues, people will look to a fairer way to live. They will look to a better way, and that is socialism.
But let me ask you this. What you define as socialism, and perhaps what James and the editorial board, if there is one, of your ex-newspaper define as socialism, are two very, very different things.
Certainly. I mean, social democracy is reformist. It's not revolutionary, it's reformist. So it's reforming the existing capitalist economic system. And if you're reforming something, you're improving it, you're trying to perfect it, you're trying to make it stronger. So actually, Kristian and Aaron should be
Do you agree
that
or approve of his form of socialism?
What, of reformism?
No chance.
Instead of over-revolutionary?
No, pure socialism.
Well, I'd say there was you have to have a revolution to change things.
Yeah, I mean,
reformism.
Revolutions come in different forms, don't they? With industrial revolutions, we've had loads of different revolutions. It doesn't mean bloodshed and barricades and stuff like that. But
which was the socialist one that didn't spill blood?
Which was the liberal one that didn't spill blood. There weren't any.
Where was?
I'm not liberal, so I'm not going to argue for that. But
well, the capitalist.
Capitalism that doesn't cause people to suffer and die.
I'm afraid we do not have the time. I just want to ask you. I did ask you before the programme how many copies a day you thought your newspaper sold, and I think you said they print 10,000, but they don't necessarily.
They don't sell all of them.
Sell all of them. So the point is that it's been around as long as I've been a journalist. It's been around for a great deal longer. 1930, well, a great deal longer than I've been a journalist. Yes. But the point is that it doesn't necessarily catch hold, but it ain't ever going to die.
Yeah, that's a fair summary.
Okay. So where do we go from here? It's all cyclical, and it'll just sort of fizzle out? Or will capitalism fizzle out?
Well, I hope it does. I hope at some point I mean, above all, socialism has become fashionable again. For a lot of people, this is just a form of signaling, look, I'm somehow a bit of a rebel, I'm cool and trendy, a bit edgy, and I hope that will go away at some point and we start talking about ideas again. And in the area of ideas, socialism would.
I talked about patronising earlier. Perhaps that's what you're being here, rather realistic.
Could well be.
I'd say so.
Yeah?
I think when young people start to grow up and, you know, and get
But that's
society,
patronising as well, isn't
it's
it?
not patronising.
Why don't people take
It's
you
true.
seriously?
It's
Shen,
not.
quickly, last word.
Because things as ridiculous as calling it fashionable. It's not
It is
fashionable.
fashionable, of course.
It's a necessity. We can't live. We have no future. I can't get on the housing ladder. Most
You
people
can't live?
Yeah,
when we have
socialism is
people
not the
using
solution to
food
that.
banks and claiming universal credit while both people are in full-time employment, something is wrong with the system. It's not fashionable. It is a necessity. It is us realising that if we are going to have anything...
Or is something
And
wrong
I'm
with
going to
life?
end this, I'm afraid I have to, I would love to go on forever and ever, by quoting once again from this Yanis Varoufakis book, A Brief History of Capitalism. He says, the government serves the interests of those who run it, politicians and bureaucrats, interests that don't represent the majority of people or the planet at all. And I suppose he's suggesting that that's true no matter what political dimension or social dimension you happen to come from. From my guests, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Great to have had you on the programme again, Kristian, and thank you all for coming on. From me, David Foster, it's been too quick, but we'll be back with another edition of Roundtable pretty soon. Bye-bye for now.